The night was supposed to follow the familiar rhythm of late-night television, the kind of carefully rehearsed comfort that audiences had grown used to over the years, where laughter arrived on cue and tension never lingered too long. The studio lights burned bright and warm, washing over rows of seats filled with people who came expecting humor, maybe a sharp joke or two, but nothing that would truly unsettle them. Conversations hummed softly, scattered laughter floated through the air, and the band's final notes faded into applause as the show transitioned toward its guest segment. Then Donald Trump stepped onto the stage, and something subtle but unmistakable shifted. The applause was loud, but uneven, charged with curiosity rather than joy. Some clapped enthusiastically, others hesitated, watching closely, already sensing that this appearance would not unfold like the others. Trump's posture told its own story. He did not stroll in with casual confidence or playful charm. His shoulders were tight, his jaw set, his gaze fixed forward as if he were already bracing for impact. There was no relaxed wave, no easy grin. The energy in the room, once light and playful, began to thicken, as though the air itself had grown heavier. It was the kind of tension that doesn't announce itself loudly but presses in quietly, making people sit a little straighter, listen a little harder. When Trump began speaking, his tone was measured at first, almost restrained. He spoke about respect, about how public figures are treated, about lines that should not be crossed. His voice was steady, controlled, giving the impression of someone trying to maintain command. But beneath that control, something simmered. The audience felt it before they fully understood it. Then, without easing into it or softening the moment, Trump pivoted sharply toward Jimmy Kimmel. His eyes locked onto the host with intensity, and his hand lifted, pointing directly at him. The room fell into silence so abruptly it felt as though the sound had been cut. Even the faint rustle of movement disappeared. Trump's voice rose, not playful, not ironic, but sharp and forceful as he accused Jimmy of spreading claims he called outrageous lies. He spoke of betrayal, of irresponsibility, of repeating stories that he insisted were fabricated and cruel. According to Trump, these accusations had gone beyond politics and crossed into something far more personal. He claimed they targeted his family, dragging his wife and his son into a public storm they never asked to be part of. As he spoke, his composure visibly cracked. His face flushed, his gestures grew wider, more aggressive, his words tumbling out faster as emotion took over. He framed himself not just as a man under attack, but as a father and husband defending those he loved. Gasps rippled through the audience as people processed what they were hearing. This was no longer a performance. This was raw confrontation unfolding live. Trump's voice wavered briefly when he mentioned his children, and that moment, small but noticeable, cut through the room. He accused Jimmy of amplifying rumors without proof, of choosing shock over responsibility, of valuing attention over truth. He spoke as if this appearance had become a battleground rather than an interview, and with every sentence, the weight in the studio grew heavier. Jimmy Kimmel stood still through it all. He did not interrupt, did not deflect with humor, did not attempt to soften the blow. He allowed Trump to speak uninterrupted, letting the accusations hang in the air. That silence was powerful. It stretched each word, gave it space to echo, forced everyone listening to confront the intensity of the moment. Trump finished with a declaration that he would not remain silent while his family was attacked, his chest rising and falling as he took a breath. The pause that followed felt endless. No laughter came. No applause broke the tension. The audience understood instinctively that the night had crossed a line from entertainment into something far more serious. Whatever was supposed to happen next no longer mattered. The atmosphere had changed permanently. Trump had launched his attack publicly, forcefully, and without restraint. The question now hung unspoken but unavoidable: how would Jimmy Kimmel respond when the spotlight shifted back to him? Jimmy Kimmel did not rush to fill the silence Trump left behind, and that restraint alone began to reshape the moment. The pause stretched just long enough to make the audience uneasy, long enough for the tension to settle into every corner of the studio. When Jimmy finally spoke, his voice was noticeably calm, almost quiet, but that calm carried authority. it forced people to lean in rather than tune out. He acknowledged Trump's anger without validating it, recognizing that family is a subject that cuts deep for anyone, especially under public scrutiny. But then, with careful precision, he made it clear he would not retreat. His words were deliberate, each sentence chosen as if weighed beforehand. The casual rhythm of a comedy show was gone now, replaced by something closer to a courtroom exchange. Jimmy's tone never rose to match Trump's, and that contrast became impossible to ignore. He didn't challenge Trump with insults or sarcasm. Instead, he introduced a detail that shifted the entire direction of the confrontation. He spoke of reports he claimed to have seen, documents discussed quietly in political circles long before that night, suggesting that the very claims Trump had dismissed as lies were not as baseless as he insisted. When Jimmy mentioned DNA test results connected to Barron, the room seemed to stop breathing. The audience reacted before their minds could catch up, a collective intake of air rippling through the seats. No one spoke. No one laughed. Even the cameras felt as if they paused. Jimmy did not dramatize the statement. He did not embellish it or repeat it loudly. He stated it plainly, almost clinically, as if presenting information rather than provoking reaction. That choice made the words heavier, not lighter. Murmurs spread seconds later, followed by scattered gasps and confused applause as people tried to process what they had just heard. Trump's reaction was immediate and visible. His expression shifted from anger to disbelief, his eyes narrowing as his jaw tightened. For a brief moment, he looked caught off guard, as though the conversation had veered into territory he hadn't prepared for. Then his defenses snapped back into place. He shook his head forcefully, dismissing the statement as fiction, his voice rising again as he accused Jimmy of spreading falsehoods under the guise of questioning. He framed the entire claim as a coordinated attack, an attempt to embarrass and destabilize him publicly. The anger returned, but now it was sharpened by something else, urgency. Jimmy let him speak again, repeating the same tactic that had worked before. The more Trump spoke, the more defensive he sounded, his words circling back on themselves, emphasizing denial without offering substance. When Trump paused, Jimmy responded not by repeating the claim, but by reframing it. He explained that he was not declaring anything as fact. He was questioning power, the same way comedians, journalists, and citizens have always done. He reminded Trump that accusations, once made publicly, invite scrutiny whether one welcomes it or not. The audience reacted in waves, some nodding, others shifting uncomfortably, the room divided but fully engaged. Trump pushed back harder, accusing Jimmy of hiding behind humor while making serious allegations, insisting that the conversation was no longer fair or honest. His voice cracked slightly as frustration bled through. Jimmy remained steady. He emphasized a simple principle: if something is false, evidence is the strongest way to end the conversation. That line landed cleanly, cutting through the noise without force. The audience responded immediately, applause rolling across the studio like a tide. Trump hesitated, just for a moment, as the sound washed over him. He no longer controlled the rhythm of the exchange. Jimmy hadn't overpowered him with volume or aggression. He had redirected the confrontation entirely, shifting the focus from emotion to accountability. The clash was no longer about who could speak louder, but about who could stand firm under scrutiny. And as the crowd settled, it became clear that the balance of the night had begun to tilt, quietly but decisively, away from Trump's initial attack and toward a challenge he could not easily dismiss. Trump tried to reclaim the narrative, his gestures sharp, his voice booming again as he insisted that every insinuation was fabricated, a product of deceit designed to humiliate him and his family. His words tumbled out rapidly, fueled by frustration and a need to dominate, but each sentence seemed to meet invisible resistance, absorbed and deflected by Jimmy's calm precision. He circled the topic repeatedly, returning to the same points: no evidence, no truth, only lies meant to damage his reputation. Yet the more he spoke, the less the crowd seemed aligned with him. They were no longer caught in the thrill of his aggression, their attention had shifted. Every time Trump raised his voice, Jimmy's measured silence made his own words echo more starkly, highlighting the contrast between impulsive anger and composed clarity. The tension in the room was palpable, as if time had stretched and every word carried the weight of consequence. Jimmy, understanding the rhythm of the moment, waited for Trump to exhaust the initial surge of emotion. Then, carefully, he leaned forward, not aggressively but with an unmistakable sense of authority, and reminded everyone that accusations, no matter how loud, are powerless without proof. He challenged Trump not with mockery or ridicule, but with the logic of accountability. If something is untrue, demonstrate it, don't just shout. Then came the pivotal moment, the DNA test for Barron, suggested as a public, transparent act. The reaction was immediate, explosive. Cheers, gasps, and whispers collided, filling the studio with a chaotic energy that both validated Jimmy's control and visibly unsettled Trump. The president froze briefly, the movement subtle but telling, a flicker of realization passing across his expression. He attempted to dismiss the suggestion, claiming it was inappropriate and that Jimmy was deliberately provoking him, yet the room had already shifted. The audience no longer waited for Trump to command the scene, they were now participants, responding to the subtle mastery of words, tone, and timing Jimmy wielded. Each of Jimmy's sentences was like a scalpel, precise and purposeful, cutting through the fog of accusation, exposing gaps in argument, and subtly reinforcing the lesson that patience and strategy outweigh raw aggression. Trump responded again, louder now, attempting to reclaim dominance through sheer volume, repeating the same denials and the same insistence that all claims were fabricated. But Jimmy's calm had already established a counterweight, and the applause that followed each of his points underscored the crowd's alignment. Even Trump's body language betrayed the shift. The usual confidence wavered in tiny increments, the subtle stiffening of hands, the tightness around the jaw, the fleeting narrowing of eyes, all small signs that control had slipped from his grasp. The studio, which had begun the night buzzing with expectation of humor, was now absorbed in a high-stakes drama, a living lesson in public confrontation. Every person watching, every camera lens focused on the exchange, bore witness to the transformation, the aggressor, loud and forceful, reduced to reaction, the responder, calm and deliberate, commanding attention without raising volume. As the exchange reached its apex, the balance of power was unmistakably clear. Jimmy did not need to escalate further. He had allowed Trump's energy to overextend, leaving gaps that precision alone could exploit. Each well-timed pause, each measured phrase, reinforced his dominance in the interaction. The audience recognized it instinctively, reacting not merely to words but to mastery of presence, timing, and strategy. What had begun as a typical comedic encounter had evolved into a profound illustration of rhetoric, tension, and the subtle shifts that determine who truly controls a public moment. The audience no longer waited for Trump to command the scene, they were now participants, responding to the subtle mastery of words, tone, and timing Jimmy wielded. Each of Jimmy's sentences was like a scalpel, precise and purposeful, cutting through the fog of accusation, exposing gaps in argument, and subtly reinforcing the lesson that patience and strategy outweigh raw aggression. Trump responded again, louder now, attempting to reclaim dominance through sheer volume, repeating the same denials and the same insistence that all claims were fabricated. But Jimmy's calm had already established a counterweight, and the applause that followed each of his points underscored the crowd's alignment. Even Trump's body language betrayed the shift. The usual confidence wavered in tiny increments, the subtle stiffening of hands, the tightness around the jaw, the fleeting narrowing of eyes, all small signs that control had slipped from his grasp. The studio, which had begun the night buzzing with expectation of humor, was now absorbed in a high-stakes drama, a living lesson in public confrontation. Every person watching, every camera lens focused on the exchange, bore witness to the transformation, the aggressor, loud and forceful, reduced to reaction, the responder, calm and deliberate, commanding attention without raising volume. As the exchange reached its apex, the balance of power was unmistakably clear. Jimmy did not need to escalate further. He had allowed Trump's energy to overextend, leaving gaps that precision alone could exploit. Each well-timed pause, each measured phrase, reinforced his dominance in the interaction. The audience recognized it instinctively, reacting not merely to words but to mastery of presence, timing, and strategy. What had begun as a typical comedic encounter had evolved into a profound illustration of rhetoric, tension, and the subtle shifts that determine who truly controls a public moment. By now, Trump's attempts to retake command were met with an unyielding calm, and every effort to reassert authority served only to highlight the contrast between his reactive aggression and Jimmy's controlled composure. The night, already unforgettable, was deepening into a masterclass in human behavior under pressure, a spectacle where words alone, when wielded with patience and clarity, reshaped an entire room. Each detail, from the tightening of Trump's hands to the audience's split attention, to Jimmy's subtle smiles as applause confirmed his dominance, told a story of power lost, power gained, and the enduring principle that in the theater of public confrontation, measured restraint often eclipses forceful attack. The crowd's reactions, alternating between nervous laughter, thoughtful murmurs, and spontaneous applause, reflected an invisible narrative unfolding beyond the words themselves, a story of authority claimed through control of self rather than volume, influence secured through clarity rather than chaos. And in the center of it all, the lesson became undeniable: one calm, deliberate voice can redirect the trajectory of any conflict, turning aggression into opportunity, loud accusations into mere background noise, and fleeting outrage into a stage upon which composure and intellect prevail. The tension had reached its zenith, but the resolution was still unfolding, a slow burn that promised a conclusion as impactful as every earlier word had been, leaving both the participants and the audience suspended in a moment that felt larger than the room itself. By now, Trump's attempts to retake command were met with an unyielding calm, and every effort to reassert authority served only to highlight the contrast between his reactive aggression and Jimmy's controlled composure. The night, already unforgettable, was deepening into a masterclass in human behavior under pressure, a spectacle where words alone, when wielded with patience and clarity, reshaped an entire. As the minutes stretched, the energy in the studio reached a tangible peak, a charged mixture of anticipation, disbelief, and admiration that seemed almost physical, settling over every person present. Trump, who had entered with the unmistakable force of someone intent on dominating, now found himself caught in the current of his own making, the fervor of his initial assault transformed into a chain of reactive motions, defensive words, and flashes of uncharacteristic hesitation. Every attempt to regain control was met with subtle but undeniable resistance, the kind that did not require interruption, mockery, or elevated volume. Jimmy Kimmel had redefined the rules of engagement simply by remaining composed, deliberate, and unwavering. The audience, no longer passive spectators, became active participants in the exchange, their reactions, claps, gasps, murmurs, shaping the narrative as much as any spoken word. The lights above reflected the intensity, catching glints in the eyes of both the audience and the participants, capturing a moment where theatricality and reality blurred seamlessly, where the tension of human confrontation was laid bare in every gesture, glance, and pause. Jimmy's strategy was evident in every measured sentence: allow the opponent to expend energy, expose inconsistencies through clarity, and invite the crowd to witness the contrast between reaction and reason. He did not need to escalate. He did not need to compete in volume. Each calm phrase became a weapon of influence, a demonstration of the subtle, often overlooked power of timing, tone, and presence. Trump's reactive force, initially commanding, now seemed almost raw and unrefined in contrast, each shouted denial and flailing hand gesture emphasizing the very points Jimmy's poise had made for him. The suggestion of a public DNA test, the reminder that proof carries weight beyond mere assertion, punctuated the sequence like a dramatic crescendo, triggering an immediate and explosive response from the studio audience, whose energy, once aligned with anticipation, now shifted decisively toward recognition of the composure and authority Jimmy exuded. Trump's usual confidence wavered, his expressions flickering between indignation, frustration, and brief glimpses of reflection as he absorbed the weight of not only his opponent's words but the crowd's response. He attempted to pivot, to reclaim initiative, but the momentum had irrevocably shifted. Every gesture now seemed reactive, each statement a step behind the narrative Jimmy had already established. The studio had become a living illustration of power dynamics in real time, that influence is not always claimed by the loudest voice, that authority can emerge quietly, yet irresistibly, through calculated control, and that public perception is as much sculpted by the observer's response as by the actor's intention. Jimmy's closing moments, serene yet commanding, carried the full weight of the confrontation, not through aggression but through the deliberate orchestration of clarity, timing, and restraint. "You started it, and I will end it," he said, concise, unwavering, allowing the audience to absorb the finality of the statement without embellishment, without theatricality, leaving Trump visibly momentarily unmoored, his own words rendered secondary in the wake of carefully applied composure. The applause that followed was thunderous, layered, resonant, not simply in reaction to entertainment but in recognition of a shift in power, a public acknowledgement of control asserted without force, authority demonstrated without aggression. As the show drew toward its conclusion, the narrative of the evening had transformed entirely, from an anticipated skirmish to a vivid lesson in confrontation, restraint, and the profound influence of deliberate presence. Trump's departure from the stage, his posture no longer brimming with the unyielding command he carried at entry, contrasted sharply with Jimmy's final stance, calm and composed, arms relaxed, gaze confident, the embodiment of a subtle but undeniable victory achieved not through attack but through strategic patience. The audience, whether laughing nervously, reflecting in stunned silence, or exchanging amazed glances, carried with them the imprint of the night, understanding instinctively that what they had witnessed was not merely a clash of personalities but a masterclass in human interaction, a study in how aggression can open doors for measured response, and how clarity, patience, and timing can completely overturn the anticipated trajectory of a confrontation. The lights dimmed, the crowd dispersed, yet the echo of what had transpired lingered like a tangible presence in the studio, a living reminder that words released into the world shape reality in ways beyond immediate control, that the loudest voice is not always the most commanding, and that composure and calculated response often leave the most enduring impact. By the end, it was undeniable, Jimmy Kimmel had transformed what could have been a chaotic display of accusation into a testament to the power of restraint, the subtle art of command, and the unassailable authority that comes from mastery of one's presence. Trump, though still imposing in stature, had been challenged, pressed, and ultimately overshadowed, not by volume, not by theatrics, but by the quiet, relentless force of focus, clarity, and strategic timing. The night would remain indelible in memory, a testament to the nuanced ballet of confrontation, and a vivid example that in moments of public conflict, the true measure of power lies not in who strikes first, but in who responds with control, intelligence, and unwavering composure, leaving the audience with a lesson in authority, influence, and the enduring impact of a moment carefully mastered.